Hey everyone, Mark Hall here from Knockbreda Parish Church. One of the great things about the Christian church is that it didn't begin yesterday, which means that for thousands of years, millions of people have been facing the same kinds of challenges as we do today. And when we look back to the people who went before us, they can often help us cope. One of those people is a man called John Flavel, or John Flavel, depending on your pronunciation. John Flavel was born in England and he became a Christian minister, but his life was absolutely surrounded by destruction. His father died of the plague, his wife died giving birth, his second wife died, his third wife died, he had a child that died, he was sacked from his job, and he spent most of his life on the run from authorities. His life was surrounded by destruction, and in many ways, just like we would today, he wondered how he would cope. Well, John Flavel turned to one of the Psalms, and Psalm 57 was the psalm really that would help him cope. Because in Psalm 57, King David is surrounded by destruction. He's on the run, his enemies are after him, and his life is in danger. And what King David says in verse 1 is that he will look to God and take refuge in the shadow of God's wing until the waves of destruction pass him by. Well, when Flavel read this, he was so comforted that as he was surrounded by destruction, he could look to God and he could take refuge. He would find safety and security in the shadow of God's wing until the destruction that surrounded him would pass him by. But there was something that Flavel was really helpful on, and it was that he pointed out in verses 2 and 3 why it is that King David and he and us today could look to God and find refuge, safety and security in the shadow of his wing. And what he noted was that in verses 2 and 3, the psalm tells us that God is sovereign and that God always fulfills his plans and purposes for his people. God is sovereign, it means he's in control of the whole world. And when we say that God fulfills his plans and purposes for his people, what we're really saying is that in the midst of this world, God has an unfolding plan. So that through the circumstances of life, God is using the circumstances of life in order to benefit his people. Now it seems strange that David, as he's surrounded by destruction, can say that God is fulfilling his plans and purposes for his people. And we're not really told exactly what those are, but the Bible does tell us that God's ultimate plan and purpose for his people is salvation, which means that even in the dangers themselves, God is working through those circumstances of life in order to save him. Not just physically, but ultimately save him from his sin. Which is why the psalm then goes on to say, I will fix my heart on God and praise him. Well, when John Flavel read this, his heart was warmed as he was able to look to a sovereign God who was working in the midst of the dangers of life, that through those circumstances he would save him, that he would forgive him of his sin, and he would work in him and through him to change him, that he would become more and more like Jesus, that he too could then look to God, set his heart and fix it upon him and praise him. Today, in many ways, we feel like we are surrounded by danger as we see people getting this disease and we see people dying. And yet we too have a God who is sovereign. He's in control and he is fulfilling his plans and purposes for his people. That through these circumstances of danger, God will save. He will forgive his people and he will use these circumstances in life to make them more and more like him, fulfilling his plan and purpose of salvation. This psalm's about King David, but it ultimately is fulfilled in a greater king, King Jesus, who the Bible tells us at the perfect time left heaven to come to earth, into this dangerous earth. And while he lived in the midst of the dangerous circumstances of life, he would be led to a cross where he would lose his life. And yet Peter tells us in Acts chapter 2 that everything that happened to Jesus was the unfolding or the outworking of a sovereign God's perfect plan. Because it was through his death and his resurrection that Jesus Christ would rise from the dead to be exalted as the Lord of all creation, so that he could work in and through the dangerous circumstances of life to save his people and to help them to fix their hearts on him and forever to praise him. When we look back at the Christian church, we find people who have faced circumstances like us. And we find people who turn to the Bible, who find a sovereign God, who works in and through the circumstances of life to fulfill his plans and purposes of salvation. So this week, may we join the people who have gone before us and turn to Psalm 57 and know that we have a sovereign God who, in the midst of the dangers of this life, is fulfilling his plans and purposes for his people, his plan and purpose of salvation.